Imagine being trapped in a marriage that started as a cold, calculated contract, only to discover emotions you never thought possible. In today's story, we dive into the life of a shy millionaire and the woman who changed his world forever. Betrayal, redemption, and a love worth fighting for. This is a journey you don't want to miss. If you love stories filled with drama, romance, and second chances, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's get started. The city skyline glowed in the fading light of sunset, a breathtaking view from the top floor of Marshall Innovations headquarters. Inside, Damien Marshall stood motionless by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection staring back at him. At just 33, he had built one of the most successful software companies in the world, yet his life felt hollow, defined by algorithms and deadlines rather than human connection. The weight of his late father's will pressed heavily on his shoulders. The terms were clear: marry within 6 months or lose control of the company he had poured his life into. Damien's jaw tightened as he reread the document for the 100th time. Marriage wasn't just a challenge for him, it was a near impossibility. His crippling social anxiety had kept him isolated for years, and the thought of opening his life to someone else felt like stepping into a void. But time was running out. The soft hum of the city below was the only sound in Damien's expansive office. The room, filled with sleek furniture and cutting-edge technology, felt as cold and impersonal as his life. He sat at his desk, staring at the legal documents spread before him. His father's signature at the bottom of the will seemed to mock him, a final challenge from a man who had always pushed him to be stronger, braver, better. Damien ran a hand through his dark hair, his smartwatch vibrating softly against his wrist, a reminder of yet another missed meal. He ignored it, his mind racing. Marriage. The word itself felt foreign, like a concept from a life he'd never lived. How could he possibly find someone to marry in 6 months? And even if he did, how could he trust them? His wealth and status had always been a barrier, attracting people who wanted his money, not him. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Wesley Green, his family's longtime attorney, stepped in, carrying a folder. Wesley was in his late 50s with a calm demeanor that had always been a source of stability for Damien. "I've been thinking about your situation," Wesley began, placing the folder on the desk. "There's a way to meet the terms of the will without complicating your life too much." Damien raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "I'm listening." Wesley opened the folder, revealing a neatly typed proposal. A marriage contract, a legal arrangement, no emotions, no expectations, just a partnership to fulfill the terms of the will. After a year, you can part ways and your company remains yours. Damien leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping anxiously against the desk. And who exactly would agree to something like this? "I have someone in mind," Wesley said, his tone measured. "Her name is Eve Langford. She's a medical researcher, brilliant and hardworking. She's in a difficult financial situation, and this arrangement could benefit both of you." Damien hesitated, his mind racing. A contract marriage? It felt cold, calculated, but as the clock ticked down, he realized he might not have another choice. Across town, in a small, cluttered apartment, Eve Langford sat hunched over her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional cough from the next room were the only sounds breaking the silence. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., another sleepless night. But she couldn't stop now. The grant proposal she was working on might be her last chance to secure funding for her research, and she needed every penny she could get. Eve's life had always been a balancing act. By day, she worked as a medical researcher at a small lab, studying experimental treatments for rare diseases. By night, she was a caregiver, tending to her younger sister Cora, who had been battling a debilitating illness for years. Cora's condition had worsened recently, and the experimental treatment she needed was far beyond what Eve could afford. The mounting medical bills were suffocating, and no matter how hard Eve worked, it never seemed to be enough. a soft voice called from the next room. Eve. Eve immediately closed her laptop and rushed to Cora's bedside. Her sister, pale and frail, managed a weak smile. You're still working, aren't you? Eve brushed a strand of hair from Cora's face. Just finishing up. Don't worry about me. You need to sleep, Cora whispered, her voice barely audible. You can't take care of me if you're running on fumes. Eve forced a smile, though her chest tightened with guilt. I'll sleep soon. Promise. The next morning, as Eve sipped her third cup of coffee, her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. Hello? Miss Langford, this is Wesley Green. I'm an attorney representing a client who has a unique proposition for you. Eve frowned, unsure of what to make of the formal tone. I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong person. I assure you I don't, Wesley replied. This opportunity could solve your financial troubles and provide the resources your sister needs for her treatment. Would you be willing to meet and discuss the details? Eve hesitated, her mind racing. She had no idea what this was about, but the mention of Cora's treatment made her pause. All right, she said finally. I'll hear you out. As she hung up, Eve couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Eve adjusted the strap of her bag nervously as she stepped into the sleek, modern conference room at Marshall Innovations. The walls were lined with glass, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Everything about the space screamed wealth and power, a world far removed from her own. She felt out of place in her simple blouse and skirt, but she straightened her shoulders, determined to hold her ground. At the far end of the room, a man stood with his back to her, staring out the window. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped tightly behind him. Wesley Green, the attorney who had called her, stood nearby, offering her a polite smile as she entered. Ms. Langford, thank you for coming, Wesley said, gesturing for her to take a seat. This is Damien Marshall. Damien turned slowly, his sharp features illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the windows. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, but there was something guarded about him, as if he were bracing himself for an invisible blow. He nodded curtly in greeting, his gaze flickering to her for only a moment before dropping to the floor. Mr. Marshall, Eve said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. I was told you had a proposition for me. Wesley cleared his throat, stepping in to explain. As I mentioned on the phone, Mr. Marshall is in a unique situation. His late father's will requires him to marry within 6 months in order to retain control of his company. We're proposing a contractual arrangement, a marriage in name only, for a period of 1 year. In return, Mr. Marshall will provide financial compensation, including full coverage of your sister's medical expenses. Eve's breath caught. The offer was staggering, almost too good to be true, but the idea of marrying a stranger, even for a year, felt surreal. And what happens after the year is up? She asked cautiously. The contract will end, Wesley replied. You'll be free to go your separate ways. Eve glanced at Damien, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. His hands were clenched at his sides, and he seemed to be avoiding her gaze entirely. She couldn't tell if he was indifferent or just uncomfortable. I understand this is a lot to take in, Wesley continued, but this arrangement could benefit both of you. Eve hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of Cora, of the mounting bills, of the sleepless nights spent worrying about the future. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but maybe, just maybe, it was the lifeline she needed. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice firm. I'll sign the contract. Damien's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. For a brief moment she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or maybe curiosity. But just as quickly, it was gone. Then it's settled, Wesley said, sliding the papers across the table. Welcome to the arrangement. Eve stood in the doorway of Damien's penthouse, her suitcase in hand, feeling as though she had stepped into another world. The space was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. The furniture was sleek and modern, all sharp edges and muted tones, but it felt cold, like no one truly lived there. It was a reflection of Damien himself, she thought, impressive but distant. Damien appeared from the hallway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He looked as uncomfortable as she felt, his gaze darting around the room as if he couldn't decide where to look. "Your room is down the hall," he said, his voice clipped. "Wesley had it prepared for you." "Thank you," Eve replied, her tone polite but guarded. She wheeled her suitcase past him, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She could feel his eyes on her back, but when she glanced over her shoulder, he had already turned away. The first few days were awkward, to say the least. Damien kept to himself, spending most of his time in his home office, where the glow of multiple monitors illuminated his face late into the night. Eve, meanwhile, tried to settle into her new surroundings, though the penthouse felt more like a museum than a home. She spent her mornings at the hospital with Cora, and her afternoons working remotely on her research, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But it was the small, unexpected moments that began to chip away at the wall between them. One evening, as Eve unpacked a box of books in her room, she accidentally nicked her finger on the edge of a sharp corner. She hissed in pain, and before she could even grab a tissue, Damien appeared in the doorway, a small first aid kit in hand. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice soft but firm. He stepped closer, his movements hesitant, as if he were unsure whether she would let him help. "It's just a scratch," Eve said, but Damien ignored her, carefully taking her hand in his. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cut and applied a bandage. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. When he finally let go, Eve found herself staring at him, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, retreating as quickly as he had appeared. But that night, as Eve lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the way his hands had trembled slightly as he held hers. Over time, their interactions became less strained. Eve began to notice the little things about Damien, the way he tapped his smartwatch when he was nervous, the way his eyes softened when he talked about his late mother, the way he always left a cup of coffee on the counter for her in the mornings, even though they rarely ate breakfast together. In return, Damien found himself drawn to Eve's quiet strength. She was nothing like the people he was used to, those who fawned over his wealth or tried to impress him. Eve was genuine, unpretentious, and fiercely independent. She didn't try to pry into his life, but when he did open up, she listened without judgment. One night, as they sat on the penthouse terrace overlooking the city, Damien surprised himself by sharing something he had never told anyone. "I don't think I've ever had a real friend," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eve turned to him, her expression soft. "Maybe you just haven't met the right people yet." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in years, Damien felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this arrangement wasn't just a means to an end. Maybe, just maybe, it could be something more. The invitation had arrived weeks ago, but Damien had been dreading it ever since. The annual Tech Innovators Summit was one of the most prestigious events in the industry, and as the CEO of Marshall Innovations, his attendance was non-negotiable. But the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people delivering a keynote speech made his chest tighten with anxiety. Eve found him pacing in the living room the morning of the event, his smartwatch vibrating incessantly as he tapped it, a nervous habit she had come to recognize. His usually composed demeanor was unraveling, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Damien," she said gently, stepping into the room, "you're going to be fine." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mix of frustration and vulnerability. "You don't understand. I can't do this. I'm not good at this." Eve crossed her arms, her tone firm but kind. "You're brilliant, Damien. You've built an empire with your ideas. You just need to trust yourself and maybe let someone help you." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how." Eve stepped closer, her voice softening. "Then let me stand with you. I'll be there, right by your side." Damien looked up, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Of course," she said with a small smile. "We're in this together, remember?" Later that evening, as they arrived at the summit, Damien's nerves were palpable. The room was filled with industry leaders, journalists, and investors, all waiting to hear from him. Eve stayed close, her presence a steadying force. When it was time for his speech, she walked with him to the stage, her hand brushing lightly against his arm in reassurance. At first, Damien stumbled over his words, his voice faltering under the weight of so many eyes. But then he glanced at Eve, standing just off to the side, her expression calm and encouraging. Something in her gaze steadied him, and he took a deep breath, finding his rhythm. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. Damien stepped off the stage, his heart still racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. He turned to Eve, his voice low but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, I couldn't have done that without you." Eve smiled, her eyes warm. "You didn't need me, Damien. You just needed to believe in yourself." But as they walked out together, Damien couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he did need her after all. The photos hit the tabloids like a wildfire. Damien sat frozen in his office chair, staring at the screen of his laptop as the headlines screamed accusations. "Damien Marshall's wife, a gold digger with a hidden agenda?" Beneath the bold text were grainy images of Eve, seemingly meeting with a man in a dimly lit cafe. The captions suggested she was conspiring with someone to exploit Damien's wealth. His chest tightened as he scrolled through the article. The man in the photos was unrecognizable, but the narrative was clear. Eve was using him. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the board of Marshall Innovations was beginning to trust his leadership again, this scandal threatened to undo everything. Victoria Ayres, a rival tech entrepreneur and longtime adversary of Damien, had orchestrated the entire scheme. She had been waiting for an opportunity to discredit him, and the marriage contract was the perfect target. Hiring a private investigator, she had fabricated the photos and leaked them to the press, knowing it would plant seeds of doubt in Damien's already fragile trust. When Eve returned to the penthouse that evening, she found Damien in the living room, his expression cold and distant. The warmth she had grown used to seeing in his eyes was gone. "Damien?" she asked, setting her bag down. "What's wrong?" He turned the laptop toward her, the article glaring back at her like an accusation. "Care to explain this?" Eve's brow furrowed as she scanned the screen. Her face paled as she realized what it implied. "This isn't what it looks like," she said quickly. "I don't even know who that man is." Damien's jaw tightened. "Then why are there photos of you with him? Why would someone go to this much trouble if there wasn't some truth to it?" Eve's heart sank. "You think I'm capable of this, after everything we've been through?" "I don't know what to think," Damien admitted, his voice low but sharp. "I've been burned before, Eve. I can't afford to be wrong about this." Tears welled in Eve's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I thought you trusted me," she said, her voice trembling. "But clearly I was wrong." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving Damien alone with his doubts. As the door closed behind her, Damien felt a pang of regret, but his fear and insecurities kept him rooted in place. Eve spent the night at the hospital with Cora, focusing on her sister's recovery and trying to push the pain of Damien's accusations out of her mind. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had been broken. The penthouse felt emptier than ever. Damien sat in the darkened living room, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face. He had read the article a dozen times, dissecting every word, every photo, but something about it didn't sit right. His mind replayed the look on Eve's face when she saw the accusations. Hurt, disbelief, and something else. Betrayal. Wesley Green's voice broke through his thoughts as the attorney's call came through. "Damien, I've been digging into the source of those photos," Wesley said, his tone urgent. "They're fake. The man in the pictures? He's an actor. And the person behind this? Victoria Ayers." Damien's stomach dropped. "Victoria?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been trying to discredit you for years," Wesley continued. "This was her way of hitting you where it hurts. I have the evidence to prove it." Damien's grip on the phone tightened as guilt washed over him. He had let his insecurities cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had pushed away the one person who had stood by him without asking for anything in return. He had doubted Eve, and now he might have lost her for good. Without hesitation, Damien grabbed his coat and headed for the hospital. He knew where Eve would be by Cora's side. When he arrived, he found her sitting in the waiting room, her head resting in her hands. She looked exhausted, her usual strength dimmed by the weight of the past few days. "Eve," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone guarded. "I was wrong," Damien said, stepping closer. "The photos, the accusations, they were all lies. Victoria set it up to hurt me, and I let her. I let my fears get the better of me, and I hurt you in the process." Eve's expression softened, but the pain in her eyes remained. "You didn't trust me, Damien. After everything, you still doubted me." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." Eve hesitated, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. "I need time," she said finally. Damien nodded, his gaze steady. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." The days that followed were quiet but heavy with unspoken emotions. Damien gave Eve the space she asked for, but he didn't retreat into his usual solitude. Instead, he made small but meaningful efforts to show her he was serious about earning back her trust. Every morning, he sent updates to Wesley and his legal team to ensure Victoria Ayers' sabotage was fully exposed. He also arranged for a public statement to clear Eve's name, making it clear that the accusations were baseless and fabricated. It was a bold move, one that risked his own reputation, but Damien didn't care. Protecting Eve mattered more. Eve, meanwhile, spent most of her time at the hospital with Cora. Her sister's condition was improving, but the emotional toll of the past few weeks weighed heavily on her. She couldn't stop thinking about Damien, his apology, his regret, and the vulnerability in his voice when he said he would wait for her. Part of her wanted to forgive him, but the wound of his doubt still lingered. One evening, as Eve returned to the penthouse to pick up some of her belongings, she found Damien in the kitchen. He was attempting to cook something she had never seen him do before. The sight was almost comical. The usually composed CEO fumbling with a recipe on his tablet, his sleeves rolled up, and a streak of flour on his cheek. "Damien," she said, her voice laced with surprise. He turned, startled, and nearly dropped the whisk in his hand. "Eve," he said, his tone soft. "I didn't expect you back tonight." "What are you doing?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He gave her a sheepish smile. "I thought I'd try cooking. I figured it's about time I learned how to do something normal." Eve couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the tension between them. "You're a mess," she said, stepping closer. "Maybe," Damien admitted, his smile fading slightly. "But I'm trying. For you." Her laughter faded as she looked at him, really looked at him. There was no arrogance, no defensiveness, just a man who was willing to admit his mistakes and do whatever it took to make things right. "Julian," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can forget what happened, but I can see you're trying, and that means something." His eyes lit up with hope. "I'll keep trying, Eve, for as long as it takes." For the first time in weeks, Eve felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The following weeks were a slow but steady journey toward healing. Damien didn't push Eve for forgiveness. Instead, he focused on showing her through his actions that he was committed to rebuilding their relationship. He made time to visit Cora at the hospital, bringing books and small gifts to brighten her days. He even began working with a charity that supported families dealing with long-term illnesses, inspired by Eve's dedication to her sister. Eve noticed the changes in him. Damien, who had once been so guarded and distant, was now more open and vulnerable. He wasn't just trying to win her back. He was trying to become a better man. And while the pain of his initial doubt still lingered, she couldn't deny that he was making an effort. One evening, Damien invited Eve to dinner at the penthouse. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to take that step, but something in his voice convinced her to say yes. When she arrived, she was surprised to find the dining room transformed. The table was set with candles and fresh flowers, and the faint sound of soft jazz played in the background. "You did all this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Damien smiled nervously. "I had a little help from Zara," he admitted, referring to her best friend. "But I wanted to do something special for you." Eve couldn't help but smile. "It's beautiful." As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in weeks. They talked about everything: Cora's recovery, Damien's plans for the company, and even the small, mundane details of their day-to-day lives. For the first time in a long time, it felt natural, like they were two people who truly understood each other. After dinner, Damien led her to the balcony where the city lights sparkled like a sea of stars. He turned to her, his expression serious but tender. "Eve," he began, his voice steady. "I know I've made mistakes. I let my fears and insecurities get in the way, and I hurt you. But I want you to know that you've changed me. You've shown me what it means to care about someone, to trust someone, and I don't want to lose that." Eve looked at him, her heart pounding. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he rarely let anyone see. "Damien," she said softly, "I can't promise that everything will go back to the way it was overnight, but I can see how hard you're trying, and I want to try too." Relief washed over Damien's face, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to hope. "That's all I could ever ask for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As they stood together on the balcony, the city stretching out before them, Eve felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Their journey had been anything but easy, but for the first time, she believed they had a chance at something real, a new beginning.